Hey everybody, I'm Tarik. This is my demo Scenes from an Expedition for Vienna Symphonic Library's Synchron Prime Orchestra. I'll be doing a full section-by-section breakdown of the track, focusing mainly on orchestration. But first, here's the demo, and then we'll get into it. First things first, let's take a look at Synchron Prime Orchestra. For strings, we actually have two sections. We have a larger 46-player section from Synchron Strings Pro, and a smaller 22-player section from Synchron Elite Strings. For brass, we have the standard selection of instruments, including trumpets, horns, trombones, a bass trombone, and a tuba, including solo and ensemble patches for the applicable instruments. For the woodwinds, we have what you'd expect out of a double woodwind ensemble, all the way from piccolo to contrabassoon, as well as some extras. For percussion, we have the traditional array of orchestral percussion, along with a few extra instruments. And we do also have a few freebies, which I've chosen to use in this track, which are available on VSL's website to anyone with a VSL account. Alright, without further ado, let's get into the track. To start off, I've actually used the soft Imperial Freebie, and I'm just using that to play some nice open voicings, introduce the first main motif, along with the chord progression that goes into it. For the strings, I'm starting off with the larger ensemble here. I have the violas playing the melody, I have celli playing some divisi harmony, and then basses playing the same open voicings with pizzicato. It's a very bare bones orchestration, but it does the job, fills it out just enough to open up the track. In the percussion, nothing too crazy, just glockenspiel playing two notes. I have celeste doubling the chords of the piano more or less, and then I have celeste and harp over here play this really nice sort of filler line to fill in the space while we're just waiting for that last note of the melody to end. Very nice and spacey. That said, let's take a listen to the full section before we move on to the next one. Moving on, let's actually take a listen to this section first, and then we'll break it down. Cool. So starting off with the strings, I've actually layered both the larger and smaller section here, because when you take that larger section in the big room and the smaller section in the studio, and you put them together, they function the same. You can copy all your MIDI, but you get the best of both worlds. Very big, full, rich section. Compositionally speaking, I have Violins 1 playing the melody here, Violins 2 harmonizing the same lines, then going into unison in the middle here, and eventually into octaves towards the end. While the rest of the strings, the violas, celli, and basses, are just playing these big open pad voicings to support that. All the attention is focused on the violins, or I guess the melody, as you'll see. In the brass, I have horns and low brass playing some chords to fill out the space and thicken up that pad, but nothing is taking the spotlight here. And in the woodwinds, we actually have something similar going on, where the bassoon section is doubling the parts of the basses, celli, and violas for the same reason. And then we have the upper woodwinds, starting with clarinet and oboes, doubling violins 1 and 2, the melody and the harmonies, followed by the flutes joining in around the second half. So let's take a listen to the brass movements together just to see what that sounds like without the strings. So you can see nothing is taking the attention away from the string section or the melody. It's all supporting it. This trick I'm doing here with the bassoons is actually something I do quite often. Bassoons can sometimes have sort of a jarring sound if you use in the wrong place, or in the right place if that's what you're going for. But I think when you have this sort of pad writing thing going on, if you just double the lower half of the string section with the bassoons, you get this very warm, rich, almost silky, but still in the low end texture that doesn't really pop out, but really amplifies the sound of those low strings and just supports them. Let's have a listen really quick, just the bassoons on their own. As far as percussion goes, there's nothing much going on here. Just a few hits to signify the start of a new section. And then I have celeste playing these sort of octave flam things to accentuate one of the phrases in the melody, which I'll show by soloing the celeste and these strings together. Very subtle, but very tasteful in my opinion. The last thing I want to talk about is actually this one note in the Harp Glissandos Freebie, which I've used to, again, signify the start of a new section, but also to transition into that section a little smoother with something soft, shimmery, sparkly, I guess, if you want to describe it that way. Nothing crazy going on there, just a nice effect, a nice texture to add. Moving forward, let's take a listen to the next section and we'll break it down again. So as you can tell, big jump in tempo, big jump in energy, and instead of this pad writing kind of thing, we've moved more into an ostinato focused motion. Starting with the strings, I have basses and celli playing pizzicato, more or less doubling each other. With this awesome pizzicato run here, let's take a listen to that really quick. Come on, that sounds awesome. And then I have celli and divisi with violas playing this ostinato using the staccato agile articulation. After this break, I have violins in octaves again, playing the melody, and although I am mainly using the legato articulation here, I'm using the marcato attack, and I'm separating the notes for a more detached kind of phrasing. I think it sounds great, and I use some of the shorts to get the phrasing right in this middle section. Altogether, the strings sound like this. Now you'll notice towards the end there we have that long note, da da da, and that just stays there for a while. We could leave that as is, or as I've chosen to do, fill that in with a sort of call and response figure. And what better way to do that than with the iconic John Powell style of really fast trumpet reps. I usually don't do this, but given the capabilities of the staccato articulation of the trumpets, I just had to. I couldn't not do it. It just sounds so good. So I have trumpets and horns both playing this call and response figure after that note, which I'll show you right now. Then I have the trumpets actually follow the melody, but harmonizing in chords, while the horns and trombones play it in unison. And then low brass is just accenting some of the strong beats with some arcaddos. Altogether, the brass sounds like this. Come on, is that not a great brass sound? Moving on to woodwinds. Nothing crazy, they're just following the motor, doubling parts from the violas and celli and I guess technically basses. All they're doing is just doubling things so that we give more support to the rest of the orchestra and thicken up the sound without taking away anything in the spotlight and without cluttering the mix too much. Now, so far, we actually haven't seen a lot of action from the percussion, but here I felt it was really crucial for the sound that I'm going for. Because we have this big soaring melody and a lot of doubling going on, we need percussion to not only highlight certain things, but to support everything else. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to accent all of the bass notes with timpani, although it's important to note that timpani is not necessarily a bass instrument, that's why I'm using it here. All I have is just some hits, and rolls of course. Before anything else, we actually have a transition into this section, just utilizing some rolls from timpani, snare drum, bass drum, and so on. And then we have these really cool fills from the concert toms, which is maybe more of a drum set thing to do, but I thought it was a really cool way to use them. So let's take a listen to just the percussion here. You have a lot of cool stuff going on here, but I think the main thing is the snare drum. It's very agile and it's just carrying this motor the whole way through the section. If we listen to this section without the snare drum, it doesn't sound right anymore. Whereas if we listen to it with the snare drum, big difference from only one instrument. That's huge. It really brings a lot here, and it's very simple, but I cannot stress enough how sometimes the simple things are what really make or break the whole track. Now as for bass drum, tubular bells, tam-tam, suspended cymbal, all the same kind of thing that the timpani are doing, which is just accenting certain things. Nothing crazy going on there. But these concert tom fills are super cool. Now if we take a look at the glockenspiel, it's actually completely doubling the violins in octaves and everything, just to fill out that super high register that even the violins aren't going to touch here. And if you noticed, we have these woodblock fills, which technically double those fast call and response trumpet reps. I think it's just a super nice texture to add, and it's, I don't know, it's really fun. Now, one last thing I wanted to mention is that I'm actually using the Violins Runs freebie here, which on its own doesn't really make a lot of sense. But when you pair this with the actual violins playing the melody, I think it sounds great. Take a listen. Brings so much energy to have a recorded runs sample like that. I use these a few times in the track, and I'll highlight every time I do. Next up, we actually have a brass feature. I've taken the melody out of the strings completely and moved the violins to ostinato duty, and then I have the whole brass section playing this passage together, focusing on the horns and trombones first before moving it up minor third with more emphasis on the trumpets, and then into a honestly pretty cliche 5 sus4 ending. So, very dramatic, but very regal, very powerful. I think that brass section sounds amazing. In the strings, nothing's really changed except for the violins, which, like I said, have been moved from melody to ostinato duty. In the brass, something important I want to talk about is how we're using harmony or chords to accent certain notes. We have our melody, which is ba-da-bum, ba-da-bum, bum, and we have chords accenting certain hits, but all of the notes in those chords are underneath the melody note, as to not take away from it. If any of those notes were above the melody note, we would interpret that as the melody or as something even out of place. It's really important that when you're harmonizing the melody, you tend to keep, as a general rule of thumb, all of the harmony underneath it. That way we can focus on that top line really easily without any sort of confusion or question as to what the melody really is. Not a rule, there are no rules, but that's a good rule of thumb. Now in the woodwinds, because this is a brass feature and the brass and strings are taking up so much room together in the mix, I've actually cut out most of the section, and all I have left is the high woodwinds, the piccolo and flutes, playing some very high, fast runs to bring energy to this music and really shape the direction of each phrase. I've also doubled that with harp and the violin's runs freebie, which I think sounds great, and altogether, again, adds so much energy. Let's take a listen. Wonderful orchestral texture, always nice to use, always nice to have it up your sleeve. In the percussion, like I said, we do have harp doubling those runs, but I think the most important part here, other than the snare, which is still keeping that motor, are the timpani, which are hitting all those low note accents, doubling all the low instruments in the orchestra here, which in this case are basses, cello, bass trombone, tuba, not contrabassoon and bass clarinet, but everything else. Nice, big, beefy low-end sound, even if you're not going for the loudest dynamic. For the rest of the percussion, we have tubular bells doing the same thing but tonally, and then bass drum only accenting the most important hits. And then towards the end, of course, we have some rolls with suspended cymbal, timpani, bass drum, the usual stuff, just the transition out of it. Moving into the next section, you'll notice it's actually the same idea, but in a different key and in a different style. Let's take a listen and we'll talk about what I mean. Like I said, same melody, same idea, different style. Unlike the last section where we had this pulsing, driving motor the whole time, I've gone with the sort of John Williams, Indiana Jones style, which you can really tell by these trombones. I mean, if we just play the trombones, I think it's pretty obvious what I went for. There's no hiding that. That's okay. Now, I do think that trombones are a good place to start here because that's really the main feature of this, even though there's a big soaring melody on top of it again. I think just because it's that iconic John Williams sound that we all know and love, let's start there. We have those trombone chords playing the ostinato, and then we have bass trombone and tuba just accenting what I believe to be the most important notes, and then we actually have horns and trumpets in unison playing the melody here, which I've taken completely out of the strings. Let's take a listen to that really quick. Come on, that's Indiana Jones, let's be honest. And the strings, I've actually cut violins out entirely. We have just basses, cello, and violas doubling that trombone ostinato. I do actually have violins come back in again in the second half to play a soaring version of the melody again, which let's take a listen to. it comes to woodwinds, again, I've left out most of the section here. I just have flutes and piccolo after those runs going straight into the melody. Similarly to how I used glockenspiel earlier, this is just to sort of fill out that high register, especially because we don't have violins right now, we just have trumpets and horns playing the melody. Lastly, the percussion. There are a few minor differences opposed to the last section. Starting with the snare, it's still serving the same function, but instead of a constant motor like last time, it's more or less doubling that trombone ostinato with some ornaments in there. The last thing to point out is how the timpani are also following that trombone ostinato. It's really all about this ostinato. There's not a whole lot that variates from it. We have the melody, and then we have the ostinato playing our harmony. And everything percussive is following one of those two things. I think it really gives the whole section a tight orchestration with everything feeling together, cohesive, and nothing straying apart. In the next section, we're actually going back to that pad writing kind of thing, to a much darker, more gloomy kind of sound. Let's have a listen again, and then we'll talk about it. In the strings, I've actually used the violin's last note as a pivot into the new section. Basically, this last note of the melody here, that's the end of the last phrase, but I'm also using it as the beginning of the next phrase. And for that reason, even though everything else in the whole orchestra is very abrupt, this transition works. Speaking of the rest of the orchestra, I actually want to start with percussion this time. The very first thing we're hearing is this harp, which plays this back and forth ostinato. And then we're keeping the harp and actually adding the celeste, doubling the same part to play again the melody and the chords underneath it. We'll add in harp. We do have glockenspiel doubling the melody again, although that's actually not the most interesting thing here. I think the most interesting thing in the percussion is going to be the snare drum concert toms and woodblocks here, because they're all working together to create these fun, interesting rhythms in between each phrase. Same thing when we have that long note and we use the trumpets for a call and response. We're doing that here with the auxiliary instruments in the percussion section. If we listen to just the snare drum concert toms and woodblocks, we get these sort of intertwined pieces of ear candy just while we're waiting for the next phrase to start. I'm not trying to create any kind of groove here, it's just something to keep your ear entertained in the meantime. Next up, let's talk about the brass section. We actually have the melody being introduced on a solo horn. And just like in the brass feature, where we used chords or harmony to emphasize certain notes in the phrase, we're using a chord to emphasize the last note of this phrase. So we have a solo horn playing this melody first, and then trombones come in to double on that chord. Let's take a listen. And then right after that, we have trumpets come in with the same thing, where a solo trumpet plays the melody and it ends on a chord. Now, we do have horns playing chords throughout this whole phrase this time, and then trombones and the rest of the low brass kick in the same way on that last note. In the woodwinds, there's not much going on again. We just have that low woodwinds pad texture doubling the strings again, this time with bass clarinet included as well. Again, a very nice texture to have. And other than that, we do have some woodwinds trading off for the melody here and there, just as a double. We start with clarinet, and then we have flute right after. Let's have a listen. I should note that the melody you just heard played on the solo flute is actually being played on the violins in octaves again. But other than that, the violins have been taken out completely out of this section after their beginning phrase. The last thing I want to talk about is this descending line at the end of the section. This is played by horns and then doubled by cello, bass clarinet, and harp and celeste. All I'm doing here is using a descending scale to build some tension while that last note of the melody just rings out. It's not necessarily a call and response like earlier because it takes the spotlight this time, but it is the same concept. And the very last thing you hear before the next section is the single extra measure I've added just to build that extra little bit of tension. All I'm doing here is using a crescendo to build more energy into that loud staccato note we're going to start the next section with. Speaking of the next section, let's hear it. So again, big jump in tempo and energy here. I'm starting things off strong with a big, loud staccato from pretty much the whole orchestra, followed by some rapid staccatos from the horns and trumpets, and then of course, wrapped up by a nice, big, fat marcato at the end. If we listen to just the brass, it still sounds great. I can't get enough of these rapid, agile staccatos, but I think that very last marcato note is my favorite part of this. In the strings, we're more or less doubling what we just heard in the brass, with the violas, violins 2 and violins 1 all playing those chords together, but we have a descending line in the basses and cello before we hear that big, loud staccato and marcato hit. A mistake I see a little too often is that people have these big low brass marcatos, but they don't layer it with anything else in the orchestra. And whether or not you want to layer it with low woodwinds, I'll let you decide. But I think it's really important in a vast majority of cases to at least layer it with the basses and cello, typically in octaves. The low brass does sound good on its own, and of course the basses and cello sound good on their own too, but they both have something the other doesn't. And when we combine those two, we really get the best of both worlds again. It's just such a big, meaty sound. Have a listen. Come on, that's giving me chills. The woodwinds are actually copying the strings almost exactly, only difference being we have flutes and piccolo playing some runs up and down just to accent certain notes and transition to the next section. On the percussion, again, not much going on, but what is going on is very important. So I'm going to highlight the very few subtle things that are adding a lot here. We do have harp doubling those runs again, but if you ask me, that's actually the least important part in the percussion here. Starting off with that big loud staccato we're talking about, we have timpani, snare drum, and concert toms playing that with the rest of the orchestra. Now, that seems pretty obvious, but let's take a look at the rest of the MIDI here. Where this gets interesting is that we have snare drum roughing in on that last note of those rapid staccatos right before the big marcato hit. We have tubular bells doubling that, and then we have timpani again roughing in on that marcato, as well as bass drum and piatti. Lastly, we just have snare drum rolling out of that phrase and getting back into a motor at this faster tempo to finish off the piece of music. All together without the harp, that's going to sound like this. Again, very crucial to the sound of the whole orchestra. So with the strings, we have a similar orchestration to earlier in the track, where the bottom half of the string section, the violas, cello, and basses are all on ostinato duty, while the violins take the melody. I do have violins 1 and 2 playing the melody in octaves again, which is something that I maybe have overdone a little in this track, but that's okay. Except here, I actually have violins 2 in divisi playing some harmony lines in the middle for the first few bars. In the brass, we have those trumpet call and response phrases like earlier, just to spice things up. And then the trombones, bass trombone, and tuba have this pulsing, offbeat sort of rhythmic pattern that focuses more on beats 2 and 4 than 1 and 3. Lastly, in the brass, something important to note compositionally is that I've interrupted this pulsing brass motor with a different phrase that is still very rhythmic and driving, but instead highlights the chord choices that I made. The woodwinds, we actually just have contrabassoon and bass clarinet doubling the rest of the low instruments. I've cut out the rest of the woodwinds just to make more room, since this is a lot of action from the brass and strings, and I don't want to overclutter the mix. The percussion also isn't doing anything too special. I just have that snare motor back in action, and towards the end we have some more of those drum set type fills in the concert toms. Alright, we're on the last stretch here. Let's take a listen to the final section of this track. This is absolutely my favorite part of this track. There's so much energy, and I just love how it all wraps up at the end. Starting with the strings again, the orchestration actually doesn't change, but the melody does. We're going back and forth between two chords for a second, so I'm using the violins to highlight those two chords with this almost arpeggio-like figure. If we just listen to the strings, it sounds like this. In the brass, the orchestration actually doesn't change very much as well. We have the low brass playing staccatos on beats 1 and 3 with the chords, and then we have trumpets and horns back with those rapid, agile staccatos, but this time instead of call and response, they're doubling the melody with a different rhythm. After that, in the brass, we have a different motion similar to that in the last section where we used a different rhythm to accentuate my chord choices. We also have melody dropping out of the violins and going strictly into the solo trumpet. Let's have a listen to just the brass here. Moving on to the second half of this section, we're going into this reverse swell kind of motion, where we're starting with a big diminuendo and working our way back up with a big crescendo. We do this twice before going back into an ostinato thing and then finishing the track. Let's listen to just the strings, where the violins are still playing the melody, which is just highlighting the chord tones of the harmony. Something I didn't mention is I'm actually using the violin runs Freebie again here right before this section to introduce the violins back into the orchestra. We can see that the strings are doing a lot of heavy lifting here by shaping the dynamic direction of the rest of the track, but we're missing a lot from the rest of the orchestra. So, in the brass, I'm doing more or less the same thing where we have that reverse swell motion, except in the trumpets, I have those rapid staccatos keep moving to bring more energy and more life to this piece. Then in the last couple measures, I bring in the horns to double on that action with the trumpets, while the trombones play more of a support role. While the rest of the orchestra is diving down and rising back up, I have most of the percussion mimicking that, but I actually have tubular bells highlighting the overall upwards motion of this part. The very last thing we hear are these two notes only an octave apart. Almost every instrument in the orchestra is playing exactly this in its own register. The only variation here is the fact that I've used runs to highlight both of these notes, bring a lot more energy and life into the mock-up, and just wrap everything up with a nice, beautiful satin bow. The way I've done this is the same combo I've used previously in this track, where I have flutes and piccolo playing runs in octaves. I've layered that with the harp, and then of course I've used the violin runs freebie to layer on top of that. Altogether, I think it sounds great. Let's take a listen to the end of the track, first without and then with the runs. That's all for this breakdown. I hope you learned something or found this useful, even if it's just one or two things that you picked up. Really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching.